For more on the European reaction, let's bring in CBS News foreign correspondent Ian Lee in London. Good to see you, Ian. Following a G7 meeting today, President Biden says leaders have agreed to severely limit Russia's business dealings. What's being targeted?
Yeah, well, I mean, Russia saw this coming, but these sanctions are going to hurt them. The president said that they're going to go after Russians' ability to operate in the international financial market. I was listening to his talk today, and he said that it's going to be tougher than the SWIFT transaction. You know, they really want to make this hurt for not only the Russian government, but also the oligarchs and the families that have stashed cash overseas and around the world and make it difficult for them to operate. But, you know, the Kremlin saw this coming, and they had a taste of sanctions before when they invaded Crimea back in 2014. And so the country has shifted to become more self-reliant and has built up a sizable reserve worth $630 billion. You know, Moscow has also pivoted to China to help offset the pain of sanctions, and they really have been preparing for this. And we heard from Western leaders threatening sanctions. So, you know, Russian officials have also threatened to cut off Europe's gas and oil supply. And we need to remember that Europe relies on Russia for 40% of its natural gas. Plus, this instability has sent the cost of oil and gas skyrocketing, which will also benefit Russia. So we have seen a lot when it comes to kind of this tit for tat. And Western leaders have said a lot of people are going to suffer from these sanctions, including people here in the UK, people in the United States. But there is another side to this, with Russia trying to retaliate to any sort of sanctions. If Europe is cut off from its energy source, it's going to be forced to look elsewhere and push also to transition to alternative energy. So at the end of the day, you know, while the West puts these sanctions on Russia, you know, Russia risks losing the market for their petroleum products permanently if they do try to cut off the West as well.
And speaking of sanctions, British Prime Minister Boris Johnson has announced the UK's largest set of sanctions ever imposed on Russia. Take a listen.
We will continue on a remorseless mission to squeeze Russia from the global economy piece by piece, day by day, and week by week. And we will, of course, use Britain's position in every international forum to condemn the onslaught against Ukraine.
These sanctions will also apply to Belarus for its role in the invasion. Are other countries taking action against Belarus?
Yeah, Nicole, that's one country that is another major player in this, but hasn't been talked about. The Kremlin essentially saved the rule of Belarusian strongman Alexander Lukashenko when protesters took him on in 2020. And now Putin has called in a favor. Ukraine says Russian troops used the country to launch part of their invasion. The U.S. Treasury Department announced sanctions against 24 Belarusian individuals and entities, including the country's defense minister. The EU also says it will impose sanctions on Belarus as well. And this is on top of the sanctions the country is already experiencing over its stolen election and for forcing a commercial jet to land in the country so it could arrest and imprison a dissident.
Romania says they're preparing for an influx of several 100,000 Ukrainians fleeing the conflict. Have other nations indicated what they're preparing for?
Yeah, Europe is preparing for a wave of refugees. Ukraine is home to 44 million people. It's one of the largest countries on the continent. And we saw today, roads are clogged with people trying to flee the fighting. Many have packed up and are heading east. They are trying to get to neighboring countries, many of them belonging to NATO. The head of the UN Refugee Agency warned the humanitarian impact could be devastating. Nearly 5,000 troops from the 82nd Airborne have been deployed to Poland to help with the influx. Polish authorities say they have set up reception points for refugees along their border. Some people are already walking into the country. Moldova says it's already seen thousands of people flee as well, while Slovakia and Hungary have deployed troops to help deal with people trying to cross their borders. But we need to point out, this is not to say that all Ukrainians are trying to flee. Many have vowed to take up arms and fight back. Ukraine's armed forces, in fact, released photographs today showing people lining up to volunteer for their army.
China, which has publicly stood beside Russia in recent weeks, is refusing to call this an invasion. How are they characterizing the U.S.'s role in this conflict?
Yeah, this crisis in Ukraine is a major challenge for China. Beijing has always said that countries shouldn't interfere in the internal affairs of another country. Well, what could be more interfering than an invasion? But, China refuses to condemn Putin's actions. And while China has publicly urged restraint on both sides, it's a balancing act for Beijing. Russia and China have been forging an ever closer relationship, but Beijing also wants to maintain good relations with Europe. But at the end of the day, it also boils down to Taiwan. Just how Putin views Ukraine, well, that's how Beijing views Taiwan as part of their country. China has also threatened to take over Taiwan by military force. And if that day comes, it'll want Russia in its corner, as the West will likely throw its support behind Taiwan.
Ian Lee, thank you.